After Jack's mama died, it was awfully quiet on their farm. She died in the latter part of the summer, and all through the fall and into the early winter, there was school for Jimmy, but of course, Jack was done with that. Nobody rode the cow or pulled any shenanigans. That just didn't seem right. And then one Sunday afternoon, when they came home from church, Papa said that they'd turn on the radio, try to find a gospel program. It was getting to be almost Christmas time. He said maybe next week they'd go up into the woods and cut a tree and try to decorate it with some paper chains and popcorn and things like that. Try to cheer themselves. They couldn't be sad forever. When Papa turned on the radio, the program was interrupted by an announcement. Something terrible had happened. There had been an attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was on the news of every channel.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for further developments, which will be broadcast immediately as received.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Before Jack knew it, the United States was plunged into the worldwide conflict, World War II. War was declared on Japan and on Germany and on Italy, the Axis powers. And then as the war drug on, the United States instituted the draft. Now, the draft meant that every able-bodied man between the ages of 18 and 45 had to register, and they were given a number. If your number was drawn, then you had to give military service, no questions asked. When Jack registered for the draft, folks would say, "Now, Jack, you don't need to worry about that because on account of your mama having died just not long ago, they'd never make you serve in the Army. You need to stay home, help your daddy on the farm, take care of your little brother Jimmy." But one day when Jack walked to the mailbox, there was his draft notice in an official-looking envelope. His papa said maybe it was a good thing. There was no work around their farm, and if he went off to the Army, he'd have a lot of growing up to do. His papa put it this way. He said, "Son, the Army will make a man of you, or it'll make you wish you were a man." So Jack went. He wrote home to his little brother Jimmy as often as he could. Sometimes that was every day. He went for early training boot camp in Georgia, and he said boot camp wasn't so bad. Other boys complained about it, but Jack rather liked it. He had lots of fine clothes to wear now, not overalls and flour sack shirts, and he'd gotten rid of that pink posy underwear a long time ago. Now he had khaki uniforms for Sunday with patent leather shoes, had fatigues and boots. They got to play baseball at boot camp, not with a stick and a wad of socks like he and Jimmy used to play with. They had real equipment, leather gloves and everything. Sergeant said that was a good way to learn teamwork, to play baseball together. The food wasn't bad. Of course, the mess hall couldn't make biscuits as good as his mama used to could, but other than that, it wasn't a bad life, really. He sent Jimmy a picture of himself when he had gone to Tennessee to learn how to drive heavy equipment. He was being trained as a tank driver. Sent a picture of himself dressed in a uniform standing in front of a Sherman tank with the big cannon sticking out the top of the turret. Why, that was the most impressive thing Jimmy had ever seen. Strangest part about the photograph that Jack sent was that he was wearing a necktie. Jimmy had never seen his brother in a necktie, not even when their mama died and they went to the funeral. He'd never seen his brother so dressed up. And then, after a good while had gone by, they got a postcard from Jack, and he was in New York. Said that they'd had a little time off, and they had gone into New York City to the Radio City Music Hall to a USO show. It had seen the world-famous Rockettes. Oh yeah, beautiful girls in spangly costumes, long legs, and they'd kick their high heels way up overhead. Woo-hoo! Sounded like a lot of fun. Jimmy was hoping his brother would send him a picture of that. But he just told about it in his letter. And not long after that letter that Jack sent about the USO show, the mail from Jack just stopped. A couple days went by and Jimmy and his papa didn't think anything about it. Then a week passed and 2 weeks passed and there was no word whatsoever. The news on the radio, it wasn't so good.
This is Trafalgar Square. The noise that you hear at the moment is the sound of the air raid siren. I'm standing here just on the steps of St. Martin's in the Fields. A searchlight just burst into action off in the distance. One single beam sweeping the sky above me now.
If bad news was coming, that didn't come by mail. That was always delivered in person. From the recruitment office downtown, the Army office, a big black car would come driving out to your home, and the man who drove that car would have two gifts for your family. One would be an American flag all folded into a triangle with just the blue field of stars showing. And of course, that would be the flag that had draped your family member's coffin when they brought his body home from the war. And the other gift would be a big gold star that you could hang in your window. It was kind of a symbol, a badge of honor to folks in your community that somebody from your family, from your household, had given their life for the cause of freedom, had given their life for the defense of our country. Jimmy figured no news was good news. He'd go to the mailbox and check every day just in case. He always rode the cow. Oh yeah, after his mama died, his daddy'd let him do just about anything he wanted. So he'd ride the cow every day. He played Pony Express on the cow's back. He'd hang on to her big bell collar and whip her with her own tail and get her going good, and he'd ride down the sandy lane, pull letters out of the mailbox, and ride home. Finally, one day, when Jimmy went down to the mailbox, he opened it up, and 3 or 4 or 5 letters from Jack tumbled out on the ground. Jimmy was so excited, he came riding the cow up the driveway, yelling and screaming, "Jack ain't dead, he ain't dead, we got mail, we got mail." Papa sat down on the front porch steps, he ripped open all the envelopes and he stacked the letters by date, and he started to read the news from Jack. Jack said that he was just fine. There had been a big invasion of Normandy, France, D-Day they called it. Papa should have known all about that. It had been all over the radio. And before they had invaded, it was a big secret and nobody was allowed to write about it. That's why the mail had stopped. But now that the initial onslaught on the Germans had taken place, Jack was free to send letters again. He said not to worry. He had not been in on the first of the invasion, and so he was safe enough. But now that the beaches were secured, they were headed off through the countryside of France. Jack in his Sherman tank, he was with the 10th Armored Division, the Fighting Tigers, and their job was to keep the Nazis on the run, keep the Germans pushing back into their own country and force a surrender. He said they'd seen some hard fighting, and the work was plenty scary at times, but so far so good. He wrote in his letters that whenever they came to a French village and liberated the people there of Nazi oppression, that all the French people were very, very grateful. He said one day when he climbed out of his tank, the whole thing had been covered with flowers from French gardens. When he was riding down the road, folks would throw flowers up onto his tank as he passed by. He said in another village, he had gotten some kisses from some of the French girls. He had 5 French kisses in one day. Well, if a French girl kisses you, now that would be a French kiss, wouldn't it? And then in the last letter that Papa had in that stack, Jack had said that they had crossed from France into Germany, and he didn't think the war could last much longer now. He said that on that particular day, he figured that the Nazis were 2 or 3 days ahead, and so they had stopped all the armored vehicles and decided to take a little bit of a rest. They pulled the vehicles into a big circle, kind of like on the Lone Ranger when the pioneers would pull their wagons into a big circle for protection. Jack and all of his buddies climbed out of the tank and opened up some of their K-rations, the canned food that soldiers carried with them, sat down to have a little bit of a picnic. Jack figured you didn't need to wear a necktie for your picnic, so he tore that thing off and threw it over into the tank. And as soon as he did, his Army buddy said, "You better put your tie on, because if you don't, the old man sees you out of uniform. We're all going to get in trouble for it." Jack said, "The old man, he ain't anywhere around here." And just as he said that, someone yelled out, "Soldier!" and grabbed Jack by the shirt collar and lifted him bodily right up off the ground. Whoever he had made mad was standing nose to nose with him and was yelling and cussing for all he was worth. Finally, the man said, "You put a tie on, soldier, because I'm not putting one on you if I have to bury you." And he dropped Jack to his boots and spun around and walked away. Jack saw that he was wearing a helmet and had a riding whip tucked under his arm. Everybody knew who that was. That was the old man, George Patton, a 5-star general. He was not the kind of person you wanted to make mad. He even told the President of the United States a thing or two when it came to tank warfare. And Jack had made General Patton angry because he was not dressed properly in his uniform, didn't have his necktie on. General Patton said if his boys didn't know how to keep their neckties done up, they certainly had no business having some sissy picnic in an apple orchard to keep moving. So, since it was Jack's fault that everybody had gotten into trouble, they decided that his tank could lead the way. Jack wrote in his letter that he started up a big hill. It was so steep, out the driver's window he could only see blue sky and some clouds. But he knew as soon as he got to the top of the hill, the tank would drop, and then he could take a bearing and see which way to lead the column of vehicles that were coming along behind him. When the tank dropped over the other side of the hill, Jack realized he was staring straight down the barrel of a bazooka. A bazooka was a big shoulder cannon that the Germans would use. They would fire like a small rocket at a tank and would pierce the steel of the tank and then burst into flame, and everybody inside would be cooked like tuna fish in a can over a campfire. Jack grabbed the brake and he started to operate it. The caterpillar tracks on the tank started to dig backward, and the whole thing slid sideways and stopped at the bottom of the hill. Only 3 or 4 seconds had passed by. In that short time, Jack didn't think about the fact that he might be dead very quickly and be in heaven with his mama. He didn't think about a flag and a star being delivered to his brother and his papa. Only thought he had was, "I'm glad I have a tie on, because General Patton might be burying me soon." And then his thought was interrupted by somebody crying. Not like somebody screaming out that had been shot and they were suffering pain, more like a little kid who had lost his mommy. What on earth was that? Might have been a trap. The Germans were famous for that kind of thing. But Jack's tank was in the lead. It was his job to find out what was going on. So he unlocked the hatch and he climbed up out of the tank. And when he got up on top of the big tank, he looked down on the ground. There was a little German boy standing there, a big bazooka gun laying on the ground next to him. He was crying so hard and his face was so dirty, you could see tears streaming down his cheeks. It made little rivers of mud on his face. Jack jumped off the tank, and when he hit the ground, the boy turned around and took off running like a scared rabbit. Jack ran him down and caught him by the shirt collar. The boy turned around to fight. He was kicking and screaming and biting for all he was worth. Jack wrestled the boy to the ground. He practically had to sit on him to get him to be still. And finally, when he got him calmed down, he tried to talk to him. The little boy could speak some English, and Jack knew a few German words. And finally, he got a story out of him. The boy said that the Germans had come across that same hill just a few hours earlier. They weren't 2 or 3 days ahead, just 2 or 3 hours ahead. Jack was closer to danger than he even knew. The Germans had grabbed this little boy and said, "The Americans are right behind us. And those Americans are really bad. If they catch little German kids like you, they cook them and eat them for their supper." The little boy believed them. He had never met Americans. The Nazis, they had taken up all the radios from the German folks. He didn't hear any war news. He didn't know the Americans were the good guys. So he took the bazooka gun and he tried to shoot at the American tank, but then when he saw that big vehicle come across the top of the hill, he had panicked and he dropped the gun and started to cry. Jack assured him that Americans did not eat their children. Not even in the worst Depression years did anybody eat their kids. As soon as he got the boy calmed down, the boy realized that the soldiers could help him. He motioned for Jack to follow him. And they walked down a path, across a plowed field, and up to a little house that looked for all the world like Jack's house back in the United States. They walked through the front door and into a kitchen at the back of the house. There was an old couple seated at the table, white-headed. Jack figured they'd be too old to be this child's parents. Must have been his grandma and grandpa. On a platter between the two of them, there was a big loaf of bread covered in green mold. And Jack didn't have to speak a word of German to realize that was the only food in the whole house. The Nazis were starving their own people. The boy motioned for Jack to follow again. They went out the back door of the house and across a little clipped yard and stopped at the edge of the yard where there was a circle of white stones and fresh earth all turned over and a wooden cross stuck up in that spot. Jack knew what it was. It was a fresh grave. The boy pointed down to that grave. And tears started to stream down his face again, and he looked up at Jack and blurted out 3 English words: Mama, dead, Tuesday. Jack knew what it was like to lose your mother. He didn't have enough German vocabulary to comfort that boy, not in the least. He reached into his pocket and he pulled out a little wooden cross and he put it down the boy's hand and he closed his fingers over it and simply said, I know because my mama also died on a Tuesday. After the little boy dried his eyes, Jack walked with him back through the woods to find the other soldiers and let them know that everything was all right, nobody was in danger. And then they took up some of their K-rations and put it in a box and left it for the old couple and their grandson so they wouldn't be starved. And then Jack remembered his little brother home in the United States and how he always wanted a real horse to ride. He didn't have a horse to give that little boy a ride, but he wanted to cheer him. And so he thought he'd give him a ride on a Sherman tank. He set him right up on top of the tank and drove him all around that farm, even let him aim the cannon. They didn't shoot it. That made General Patton really mad. But then Jack had to go. His job wasn't to take care of little German orphan boys. He had to keep the Nazis on the run, bringing an end to this terrible war. All of that was written on a several-page letter that arrived at Papa and Jimmy's house. And that was the last they heard from Jack. For weeks, they had no more news. Oh, they would hear things on the radio, and then finally, the Nazis surrendered. In fact, it was news all over the world that Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, had committed suicide, but no word from Jack. Finally, one afternoon, Jimmy went down the lane to check one more time at the mailbox. There was nothing in it. But when he looked beyond the mailbox over in the weeds, he saw that old silver hubcap that they had played with years ago. Now it was all covered over in rust. He walked back into the weeds and pulled it out of the mud, and just as he stood up, he heard a car coming around the curve on the highway. The car came up to the mailbox and stopped. Jimmy recognized it. It was the government car from the Army recruitment office. A man in the back seat got out. He had a hat on, suitcase. He looked at Jimmy. Jimmy looked up at him. Finally, the man smiled and he said, "Don't you throw that behind this car. I taught you how to play that game, and I'm not going to fall for it." Jimmy couldn't believe it. It was his brother Jack, home from the war. He didn't even recognize him. He was so much bigger. He looked more serious. Jimmy didn't ride the cow home that day. He rode Jack, climbed right up on his back and got a piggyback ride home. He was thumping Jack in the shoulder and pounding him on the head. "Why didn't you write to us? Why didn't you tell us you were coming home?" Jack said after the Germans surrendered, everything went crazy in Europe. He didn't have time to write. He just had to get home as best he could. But now he was home. He was home from the war.